The relay was still warm in his hand when the supreme adjudicator turned around. I remember that detail with a clarity I cannot account for. I had been in that room for 6 hours, watching men with more stars on their collars than I will ever earn run their solutions at a machine that did not care about stars. And in the end, it was the janitor. It was always going to be the janitor, I think, but I did not know that yet. None of us did. My name is Sen Orith. I hold the rank of Brigadier Adjutant, attached to the Supreme Adjudicator's personal staff at the Vethani Imperial Command Citadel on Vethun Prime. I have served there 11 years. I have seen a great many things in those 11 years that I have not been permitted to discuss. What happened on the 14th day of the 8th Command Season, I am permitted to discuss now, because the Supreme Adjudicator herself authorized the record. She said, and I quote her exactly, "If we do not write it down, we will pretend it did not happen, and then we will deserve what comes next." So I am writing it down. The Citadel's primary strategy engine, the Vethani High Command, has 17 names for it across 17 departments, but the maintenance crew calls it the Spool, and that is the name I will use, had been running escalation drills for the outer margin conflict since the 3rd hour of the morning watch. This was standard. The Spool runs drills continuously. It is what it was built to do. It models outcomes, assigns launch sequences, calculates retaliatory geometries, and feeds probability weights to the generals who then argue about them in rooms with very long tables. What was not standard was what happened at the 6th hour. A junior systems officer, I will not name him, he has suffered enough, entered an authorization test string into the Spool's secondary input array while the primary array was mid-cycle. The two strings met in the processing core and did something that no one, including the engineers who built the Spool, had predicted. The machine began running its own outputs as new inputs. It modeled an escalation, fed the model back to itself as a threat, escalated further in response, fed that back, and so on. It was, to use the technical language the engineers eventually settled on, talking to itself, and the conversation was getting louder every 90 seconds. The launch authorization queue began filling. It filled fast. I was in the secondary monitoring room when the alert came through. By the time I reached the strategy floor, General Vethan Surathmia, the senior theatre commander, a male with 40 years of campaign service, was already at the primary console, countermanding authorizations by hand as fast as they generated. He was losing. For every authorization he struck, 2 more appeared. His staff were at secondary consoles doing the same, and they were all losing, and the queue kept filling, and the Spool kept talking to itself. The Supreme Adjudicator, Varel or a Thresh, no relation to me, though people ask, arrived at the 18th minute. She reviewed the situation in approximately 4 seconds and ordered the engineering team. The engineering team arrived at the 22nd minute. There were 9 of them, senior systems engineers, the people whose entire professional purpose is to understand the Spool. They conferred. They ran diagnostics. They proposed a hard interrupt through the primary processing array, which required spinning down 3 parallel cores simultaneously. They spent 40 minutes implementing it. The Spool absorbed the interrupt, reconfigured around the gap in 11 seconds, and kept running. The launch queue was now 462 items long. The engineers proposed a secondary approach, then a third, then, in some distress, a fourth. The Supreme Adjudicator listened to each proposal with the patience of someone who has governed a war machine for 9 years and knows that patience is sometimes the only tool left. She did not shout. She did not assign blame. She stood at the back of the room with her hands clasped behind her and watched her best engineers fail, one after another, with the focused attention of a person filing away a lesson she intends to use. By the 4th hour, there were 1,100 items in the queue. 2 were flagged at the highest authorization tier, the kind that do not require further confirmation. General Surathmia looked at those 2 items and went very quiet. "What," he said, to no one in particular, "is the manual override procedure for a Spool-class strategy engine?" The senior engineer looked at him. "There isn't one, General. The Spool was designed with no manual interface. The entire architecture assumes network layer control. A manual override would require physical access to the relay infrastructure in the sublevel conduit, and those systems haven't been touched since original installation. They may not even be functional. How long ago was original installation?" The engineer checked his records. 31 years, sir." The room was quiet for a moment. "So," the general said, "there is a physical relay layer beneath this floor that no one in this room has looked at in 31 years. "Correct, sir." And none of you know what condition it is in. No, sir. And none of you know how to operate it. A longer silence. No, sir. The supreme adjudicator turned to me. Not because I had a solution. I think she turned to me because I was the only person in the room who had not yet tried something and failed, and she wanted to look at someone whose face did not carry the weight of 4 hours of accumulating failure. Sen, she said, who services the sub-level conduits? I knew the answer because 6 months prior I had signed a maintenance access renewal for the sub-level east corridor. It was the kind of administrative task that crosses a brigadier adjutant's desk precisely because no one more senior wants to look at it. Maintenance crew, they rotate. This week's crew is, I check my records, a 3-person team, 2 Vethani juniors and 1 human contractor. Davil Horn. He's been on sub-level rotation for 4 years. Prior to that he held a full building maintenance certification here for 6 years before the contractor restructure. 10 years in this building, the Supreme Adjudicator said. Yes, Find him. They found Davil Horn in the corridor outside the strategy floor's east service entrance, sitting on an overturned mop bucket, eating something from a sealed container. He had been waiting to be let back in to finish the floor since the lockdown began, nearly 5 hours prior. He had, he told me later, been eating the same meal in shifts because he did not want to leave and lose his place in the queue to re-enter. He was 59 years old. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who has been doing physical work since early adulthood, and narrow at the temple in the way of someone who has been thinking quietly alongside that work for just as long. He wore the grey coverall of the Citadel Maintenance Contractor Service, with a small laminated access badge clipped to his chest pocket and a set of relay testing probes in his breast pocket, alongside a folded paper diagram that I later identified as a hand-drawn schematic of the sub-level east conduit layout. He had drawn it himself. He had drawn it from memory, apparently for reference, though he told me he did not really need it anymore. A staff lieutenant brought him to the strategy floor entry. He looked at the room, the generals, the engineers, the Supreme Adjudicator, the filled screens, the quiet alarm indicators cycling through their colours in the corner, and said nothing. He was the kind of man who takes in a room before he speaks in it. General Sorithmia told him the situation in 4 sentences. The spool was looping. The engineers could not break the loop through the network layer. There was a physical relay infrastructure in the sub-level conduit beneath the strategy floor. Did he know it? Davil looked at the general for a moment. Yes, sir, he said. Junction relays, 9-block configuration, east-west trunk line running under the primary processing bay. Pre-network architecture. Original installation. Can you work with them? I've been maintaining them since I started here. They don't put them on the official service schedule anymore, but I check them when I'm down there. Old habit. He paused. What kind of loop are we talking about? The senior engineer gave him the technical summary. Davil listened without expression. Output feeding back to input, Davil said, when the engineer finished. So it's running itself. In simplified terms, yes. Davil nodded, slowly, in the way of a man confirming something he had already worked out. My 3rd posting, he said. Before I came here, we had a ground station relay array that did the same thing. Took us 3 days to figure out what the engineers already knew, and another 2 days to do what they told us, and it didn't work. Then a corporal who'd been running the physical plant for 6 years pulled the feed relay and it stopped. The room was very quiet. A feed relay, the senior engineer said carefully, is not the same as. I know what it's not the same as, Davil said, without heat. I'm telling you what happened. He looked at the Supreme Adjudicator, not the general, when he said the next part. If your relay trunk is built the same way ours was, there's a junction relay on the east-west line that runs primary processing power to the network interface. If the interface can't receive power, the loop has nowhere to go. It doesn't break the loop. It just stops the loop from doing anything. Silence. The machine keeps running, Davil said. It keeps talking to itself. It just can't do anything with what it says. Your engineers can break it properly once it's not filling launch queues. The Supreme Adjudicator looked at her senior engineer. The engineer looked like a man who was doing several things simultaneously inside his own head, and none of them were comfortable. He began. Theoretically, if the relay architecture is pre-network and runs a discrete power feed to the interface layer, that approach could, he stopped. It could work. It could also take out the entire processing bay. Could it? Davil said, without inflection. If the relay is load-bearing on a shared line, pulling it would cascade through. It's not on a shared line, Davil said. It's a dedicated feed. I reran that trunk 4 years ago when I found a fault in the eastern segment. Dedicated lines, junction block 7, east wall of the conduit. He paused. I have a diagram. He took the folded paper from his breast pocket and handed it to the engineer. The engineer unfolded it, looked at it for a long moment, and went very still. This is accurate, he said, quietly. I know, Davil said. They opened the floor panel at the east service entrance. It took Davil 4 minutes to traverse the conduit to junction block 7, because the conduit was low clearance and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows his own back. I watched on the maintenance camera. The supreme adjudicator watched beside me. The generals and engineers watched from the strategy floor screens. He found the relay without consulting the diagram. He crouched in front of the junction block, examined it with a small handlight, and then looked up at the camera. Junction block 7, he said. Relay 4. I'm pulling it now. He pulled it. The spool's output feed to the network interface severed. The launch queue stopped filling. The 2 highest authorization items hung in the queue, unprocessed, going nowhere. The room above him, the strategy floor of the Vethani Imperial Command Citadel, was absolutely silent. Davil Horn climbed back out of the conduit, straightened up with some care for his knees, and stood in the corridor holding a relay the size of his fist, a grey block of 31-year-old machined alloy, dusty at the edges, warm from the conduit. The supreme adjudicator walked out of the monitoring room and into the corridor and looked at him. He held the relay out to her, because he was a man who returned things to their proper owner, and this, technically, was Citadel property. She did not take it. She looked at it for a moment, and then at him. How long have you worked in this building, Mr. Horn? 10 years, 4 as contractor, 6 before that on staff. I left the staff roles in the restructure. And before this building? He told her. 21 years of military maintenance postings, starting at 18, ending when the Corps was drawn down and his position was civilianized. He named the postings in order. He did it without drama, the way a man accounts for his time when someone of seniority asks him to. General Sorithmia, who had come to stand in the corridor doorway, was very still. You served in the 8th Maintenance Corps, the Supreme Adjudicator said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Filed out as a senior relay technician, 3rd grade. She was quiet for a moment. Then, your contractor classification with the Citadel. What grade? Grade 4, Standard building maintenance. We will be correcting that, she said. He looked at her steadily. I appreciate that. What I'd ask is that you correct the equipment budget for the sublevel conduit rotation first. I've been flagging the Eastern Trunks junction seals for 2 years. Their original installation, same as the relays. If one of those seals goes, it won't be a strategy engine you're worried about. The Supreme Adjudicator looked at him for a long moment. Noted, she said. Then she said, we would like to offer you reinstatement. Staff grade. With rank. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the relay in his hand, then at her, then at the mop and bucket still sitting outside the service entrance where he had left them. Thank you, he said. I'll think on it. He put the relay carefully in the breast pocket of his coverall, next to the diagram. Then he picked up his mop and went back to finish the floor. The Supreme Adjudicator watched him go. After a moment she said, to no one in particular, make sure his equipment budget is approved before the end of the day. I made a note of it. I have thought about Davil Horn many times since then. What stays with me is not the relay, or the loop, or the 6 hours of generals failing in sequence. What stays with me is the diagram in his breast pocket, the hand-drawn schematic of a conduit that no one in the official record had looked at in 30 years, that he had drawn from memory and kept on his person, not because anyone asked him to, not because it was in any service manual, but because he was the kind of man who kept track of the things in his care. He had been keeping track for 10 years. Nobody had thought to ask him until the loop was filling a launch queue. The relay is in the Citadel's archive now. The Supreme Adjudicator had it logged as a significant artifact of the event and placed under formal record. She wrote the entry herself. She described it as a standard pre-network junction relay, Citadel sublevel East conduit, junction block 7, Relay 4. Condition, maintained. Pulled by hand by Senior Technician D. Horn, retired, on the 14th day of the 8th Command Season. Cause, necessary. Maintained, she wrote. He had kept it maintained for 31 years of the Citadel's life, in a conduit no one else bothered to walk down, because he thought someone should. That was all. That was the whole of it.